Now we're moving over to open up for questions and comments. Just a reminder to everyone to click on the speech bubble below at the bottom of the screen to also provide your name and email address. So just in case we don't get to your question today, we can certainly get a response to you after the webinar has finished. We've got a few questions that have come in already, which I'll throw to in a moment. But just a reminder, there's a bit of a delay between you typing in your questions and us receiving them, so don't leave it till the end. If you'd like to start doing that now, that would be great. We'll start off with the first question that's come in, which is for Alan. The question, Alan, is why do you want to remove the requirement for dishonest intent? Considering people make honest mistakes all the time, why are you continuing to consider this?
Well, the main reason is that you don't need to have as an element of a new offence that there is a dishonest intent required to be proved. As we said in our submission, and as I said in evidence before the committee, the law currently provides in offences of fraud and misconduct in public office that intent. So the law already caters for that offence. And if it's serious enough for a dishonest intent to be proved, it becomes either fraud or misconduct in public office. We're not trying to penalise people who make honest mistakes, because people do, as you say, in that very sensible question. But we don't propose there be an absolute offence. We propose a strict liability offence. And the difference for lawyers, I can tell you, is that it does allow reasonable excuses to be taken into account and so forth, quite apart from the discretion that the prosecutor would have as to whether they proceed at all if the evidence was that someone simply overlooked an obligation. The idea of making it a new offence is to heighten the awareness of all elected officials in particular to their need to update their register of interest and declare conflicts of interest. And the failure to do so in the face of it being an offence under the criminal law makes it much easier to prove that there is a nefarious intent behind the failure to declare such a conflict. It's all about evidentiary facilitation, if you like, to make it more user-friendly and easier to prove.
Thanks, Alan. Next one for Nikola. Nikola, you spoke during your presentation about the functions of your office in providing advices to a number of different people, including our councillors in public office now. What's the typical turnaround time at the moment that councillors should expect if they are asking for advice from your office?
Oh, that's a very good question. So as I said, we have more than 5,000 people under the Act. So on any given day I can receive as many as 20 different advices that I have to prioritise. Unfortunately, I'm not able to delegate the advice function. So the advices are written by me, from me to you, and that can mean that there will be a significant lineup in front of you. So at the moment for local councillors, it's taking in excess of 2 to 3 weeks. If I receive more urgent matters that need to be attended to, that also will sort of set back a particular advice as well. So I would encourage you in the first instance to make yourselves familiar with all of the materials that you have available to you on all the different websites, and then also reach out to LGAQ and the local government department, any policy officers within your particular regions for just as a first step.
Thanks, Nikola. Kath, so one of the questions we've got from your presentation is in relation to vexatious complaints. And the question is, has there been any charges laid against vexatious complaints thus far?
Okay, so as I explained, we put in place this 3-step escalation process. As a result of that process, we have had only one person go past step 2 in that escalation process. That person was the subject of a criminal investigation and was criminally interviewed, but based on medical reasons, a charge was not preferred on that matter.
Thanks.
Can I just add, in supplementing that comment, there's a very fine line, I think, between punishing, as it were, by charging someone who is potentially a vexatious complainant, and destroying the faith that someone's shown in making a complaint and trying to bring to light what they believe, often wrongly, uninformed, cases of misconduct. We've taken the view at the CCC that it's far better that we get a higher workload of complaints that go nowhere, because it's a very serious step to take to do anything to discourage complainants. Our experience has been that 99.9% of complainants are genuine, although a large percentage are uninformed or misinformed, but they're bona fide. We shouldn't be discouraging them. There's a very small minority who are vexatious and make deliberately false complaints, and they should be dealt with. But it's very hard to prove, and there's very few of them.
Thanks, Alan. I suppose a follow-up question for myself in that regard. Kath, you spoke about or used the term motivated complainants that sometimes come across your desk in the context of vexatious complaints. And obviously some decisions made by councils, while having a positive impact on the community in general, can have an adverse impact on other members of the community who may feel that their voice has not been heard during the decision-making process. What advice do any of you have for councillors to avoid allegations of corruption or misconduct being made following the making of these difficult decisions?
Well, the making of difficult decisions, I suppose, is the role and responsibility of councillors, and more than any other level of government in Australia, councillors are making high-value, high-frequency decisions on every time you go into a council meeting. And I think that's why it's really important that council meetings are as transparent as possible, and how decisions are made in council meetings are as transparent as possible, including obviously when there may be some interest, which is perfectly natural in small communities, by councillors in how a decision is made. So I think doing everything that you can as a council to be as transparent in decision making and clear in your decision making process it goes a long way. There will obviously, we all know, there will be people who will be aggrieved by decisions. From the OIA's perspective, a grievance with a council decision does not come within our jurisdiction. So a lot of our focus in receiving complaints is about identifying people whose concern is not so much about councillor conduct, but a decision of council, and redirecting those matters to the Ombudsman's office, which is the more appropriate course.
Thanks, Kath.
I think I'd just add, I agree entirely with what Kath said. I think transparency is the key. People will not necessarily agree with you in making a decision that's often difficult and does reflect badly on some people, or doesn't have the right outcome for them, but they will always, or should always, respect if they can understand how you arrived at the decision. If they can't understand how you arrived at the decision, they are very prepared to, understandably, speculate that there's been a nefarious motive behind it. So transparency is the key, always.
Thanks. Another question for you, Kath. From a previous slide in your presentation, it said there had been over 1,700 complaints, yet only 36 decisions. Are the dismissed complaints able to be reassessed?
Okay, so there are 36 matters that have gone through the Councillor Conduct Tribunal and come out the other side. There are roughly a similar amount that are currently before the Councillor Conduct Tribunal, and roughly a similar amount that are currently being prepared for referral to the Councillor Conduct Tribunal. Under the Act, we can dismiss or take no further action on a matter either at assessment or after a full investigation has taken place. If we dismiss after a full investigation, we provide really detailed reasons for that. If we dismiss on assessment, then we're obviously dismissing based on a more preliminary view of the matter, and A, whether it comes within our jurisdiction, and B, whether there's really sufficient there to raise a reasonable suspicion, or whether there are reasonable inquiries that could be undertaken in relation to that matter to be able to get to the bottom of it. If a matter is dismissed after assessment, there is a review process. So the standards for, best practice standards for complaint agencies require a review capability, and we have that policy on our website. I've conducted every review myself. There's been about 77 of them, and in those cases they were matters that were dismissed where complainants were unsatisfied with that outcome. So I have reviewed those matters not just as a matter of process, but as a matter of merit and content. And in about 3 or 4 matters, I've overturned the assessment decision and said that an investigation is appropriate. So yes, there is a review process.
All right. Thanks, Kath. Nikola, a question for you in relation to, I suppose, managing conflicts of interest. Regional councils are often faced with unique issues or challenges in relation to managing conflicts of interest in small communities. They're generally not seen in our larger councils. What advice would you give to councillors as to how they can ensure that these conflicts of interest are managed well?
We experience the same kind of things with the boards. So a lot of our hospital and health boards are remotely or regionally located, as are other boards. In the materials that we've prepared with the Office of the Independent Assessor, there are some simple one-page guides for councillors who may have a conflict or may have an interest and they're unsure about what to do about it. How they should approach the matter, including what they should be disclosing to council in relation to the interest. And then in those little one-page meeting aids, it's also a list of questions that council can run through and put to the councillor who has the particular interest for council to then reach a decision about whether it would give rise to an actual or a perceived conflicts of interest under the Local Government Act. So we do have some really simple one-page guides. Prior to COVID, we were also doing some workshops with councils through last year, so that was really enjoyable. We were spending an hour and a half with council, so Kath and I would travel together and run through some hypothetical scenarios. So hopefully we might be able to get that started post-COVID. It would probably be a bit dull to do over a virtual meeting. It wouldn't have the same impact, I don't think. But there are lots of aids available, and in the if you are unsure, we would always encourage you to declare a personal interest before council and then use those meeting aids for council to decide whether it would give rise to a conflict of interest.
Thanks, Nikola. That's great.
Could I add that I'd really encourage councillors to get proactive and on the front foot with their conflicts of interest, to reflect now on what are the sorts of matters where you think you're going to have an overlap with council business, and to think in advance of how you can identify those matters and how you're going to manage those matters when they come up, rather than, I suppose, be in the situation where you're looking at an agenda item and meeting papers and seeing an issue that comes up days before the meeting is about to commence. So to really think through those issues now, get advice and put things in place so then you're really alert to it. And if there's ever any issues, you can demonstrate, if you make a record of that, that you've taken a really proactive approach and you've thought things through.
Thanks, Kath. Just a reminder to our audience, we're getting close to our time, so if you've got any final questions you'd like to send through to the head of the integrity agencies, get them through to us now. For now, I suppose a follow-up question, Kath, in relation to your presentation. You spoke about, or you mentioned the amnesty period you've got for new councillors and that the cut-off date is the 5th of August. Is there any leeway with that date? Is there any kind of flexibility in the date for new councils, or what should they take away from that?
Well, I guess there's already some leeway in the start time, but it is strictly the 5th of August. But bear in mind that we do take into account, and the Councillor Conduct Tribunal also takes into account, if misconduct has been engaged in by a new councillor or someone who's not as experienced. So we certainly, moving forward, do take that on board, and you're not going to be thrown in the deep end. A big part of the disciplinary process is about building capacity for you to be able to manage your important work as a councillor without there being issues moving forward.
All right, thanks, Kath. This one's headed constant complaints. What can we do with regards to multiple complainants raising the same issue concerns and re-prosecuting the same points? At what point does it become frivolous or vexatious?
Okay, I think I can address that, and that's where we find our escalation process very useful. There are some complainants who I have described as motivated complainants who are aggrieved by particular councils or council decisions, and who you can see a pattern of making regular complaints. As Alan says, in many cases those people have genuine concerns and grievances, and they genuinely believe in what it is that they're complaining about. But we need to manage the complaints process in a way that's balanced. That is about making sure that people who have genuine complaints are heard and that those matters are addressed and dealt with. But it's also about dealing with complaints in a way where they're finalised. If it's appropriate after an investigation to dismiss a matter and providing detailed reasons for that. And it's about having consequences for unacceptable complainant behaviour as well.
Thanks, Kath. I know the Crime and Corruption Commission faces the same challenges with multiple complaints coming in about similar issues. Alan, is there anything you want to add?
Thanks, Paxton. We do. It's unfortunately a problem for all integrity agencies. Even the best intentioned complainants sometimes have it totally wrong and won't understand, even if it's explained to them fairly carefully and transparently, that they're on the wrong path or they're misinformed. They usually add us to the level of conspirators against them. And what normally happens to us is we say eventually, we run out of patience and say, look, you've given us nothing new. This is the same old complaint you've made over the last 3 years. We won't any longer engage in correspondence with you, and that's the end of it. And the correspondence is marked accordingly. What we normally find then is they go to our oversight committee and complain about that fact. Then the oversight committee comes to us and asks us to please explain our conduct with that complainant and wastes more of our time. But that's just the process. It comes with our territory. We accept that, but I can assure you it's an ongoing huge demand upon limited resources. So people are, well-intentioned though they are, some people are very difficult to get through to that their complaint is ill-founded, uninformed or misinformed.
Thanks, Alan.
Can I just say that I think that where councillors are the subject of a motivated complainant, it can be obviously a really distressing situation, and a natural reaction to that can be to become very focused on those complainants or that association or whatever it may be. But in what I've seen and in my experience as the independent assessor over the last 18 months, I think a much more positive way to expend your energy and proactive way, and probably better for your mental health, is to just focus on your own conduct and make sure that there are no vulnerabilities there, rather than focused on those motivated people. And as best as possible, I would ask you to trust that the process that we have for dealing with escalating vexatious or improper complaints will address it.
Thanks, Kath. A question for Nikola about lobbyists. Could you outline any changes to the persons who would qualify as lobbyists, please? My understanding has always been if the person is an applicant, they are not a lobbyist. And the legislation relates to third parties. Do groups protesting development who send representatives qualify as third parties for register purposes?
So under the Integrity Act, so Section 4 deals with lobbying, and if you have a look, the definition is fairly narrow. So if you're a lobbyist, it means that you have been engaged by a third party, usually for a profit motive, so you will receive a payment or a gift of some kind, and that's to lobby on behalf or represent the third party's interests, for example, to government or in a meeting. If you're an applicant on an application, just say a town planner, whether you're listed is largely irrelevant. It's really how you came to be there and what your relationship is to whatever it is that the application is about. So it is not uncommon for town planners to be registered as lobbyists. It's not uncommon for lawyers to be registered as lobbyists as well. So it really will turn on the facts on the particular occasion. If you've got any questions about lobbying, you're welcome to get in contact with our office. Some clear examples of things that aren't lobbying though, if you're part of an association and you go forward because of your association or your membership in that group, so a common example would be a growers group, that would not be lobbying. As well, if you're an employee, a regular employee of a company and you're meeting with government or local council, then you are not there lobbying. So it is quite a specific and fairly narrow definition.
All right, thanks Nikola. This one I assume is probably for Alan, but could be addressed by a few of you. Will there be further opportunity for councils to have an input in future Belcara reforms?
I think so. There's always an opportunity for councillors and other interested parties to make submissions, not just through the formal process. There's always the formal process, of course, for legislative reform, which requires submissions to be addressed by the committee and to hear evidence about various submissions. But that doesn't stop you outside that process actively corresponding with the Minister, the DG, the Department, and us for that matter, if you'd like our help or views on what we think might be appropriate. And frankly, I think it's a very good question because I think it's very important that you become personally involved with some of these things because they directly, as you know, affect you and very much might change your daily activities. So get involved, understand it and have your say.
As well, you can make, if there is a bill or a hearing before Parliament, you can make a submission either as an individual or the council can make a submission as well, and that's a good way to have your say.
All right, thanks Alan. And Nikola, we've got a bit of a follow-up question around our vexatious complaints in the context of vexatious claims to media. How do councils report and manage the continuous vexatious statements and comments through the media?
Everyone stop there.
Well, I think, I mean, that comes down to something we've campaigned about, in fact had a public hearing about a few years ago, that if you are genuinely concerned, anyone is genuinely concerned about misconduct or corrupt conduct in our case, it is critically important that you come to us or the OIA or the Integrity Commissioner for advice without going public. You should do an approach confidentially because if you go public first to the media, it becomes a media storm. The first thing that does, if there is corrupt conduct or misconduct, is to alert the suspect. They can destroy evidence, they can get their heads together, they can make our job and the job of our other integrity agencies virtually impossible. So if you are genuinely so-called concerned about corruption and misconduct, you need to report it to the relevant authorities and give us a chance to look at it. If we say there's nothing in it and you still disagree, you can go public then. But don't go public in the first instance. It disrupts and often makes impossible a successful investigation.
All right, we've got another question here from a councillor. What action should be taken if a councillor receives an abusive email which also allows other councillors to see the content of the same email?
It's an abusive email from the member of the public, I'm assuming.
I'm not clear whether I've read it as perhaps from another councillor, but it could be a member of the public, I suppose.
Okay. So I guess if you get content, whether it's by email or social media, that's abusive from members of the public in the first instance, that's unfortunately a really unattractive part of this sort of increased social media life. And I think it's a part that I really see councillors struggle with, often to the detriment of their mental health. And I would strongly encourage councillors not to engage and not to become a part of that problem, that councillors, I guess, unlike the members of the public in that situation, are subject to codes of conduct, and their higher expectations are expected of councillors by virtue of the elected positions that they have as critical leaders within local government and their communities. So if you're abused by email from a member of the public or online, please take the higher ground and don't engage. We'd encourage you to use our impressum that we've developed with the local government associations, some rules for your website that are put there up front so that if people break those rules, then you can delete, hide or block members of the public from your website and screenshot the relevant posts that lead to that, so that there's a record of it should there be a complaint that comes down the track. So it's about balancing the need that for members of the public to be able to engage in a constructive way on matters of public interest, with the need of councillors not to be the subject of unacceptable conduct. If you receive that email and it's from another councillor, then that potentially is a breach of the Code of Conduct. So your way of dealing with that would be to report it. That will be assessed and, if appropriate, referred back for investigation.
Terrific. Thanks, Kath. One last question, I think, probably directed towards Alan. Alan, what do you think is the single most important thing that councils can do to mitigate against the risks of corruption?
I have a very strong view about this, and I think it fundamentally comes back to culture, workplace culture. At council you need to be alert, but to have a culture where you genuinely value reporting of misconduct, and people who report misconduct will not be harassed, bullied or denigrated or find it career threatening. They'll be lauded as having done the right thing, they'll be supported for having done the right thing, and all the appropriate procedures will be followed, and there'll be follow-up in terms of publishing the outcomes of such matters that come to light. If you have a culture where everyone from the first day employee to the boss's last day on the job who understands and values the reporting of misconduct so it can be dealt with, that's a very, very healthy workplace culture, and will make it very hard for any corrupt or individuals who are minded to misbehave to gain any traction at all. If they do, they'll be outed and might understand that they're in the wrong workplace. That's what you want to achieve.
Thanks, Alan. All right, well, I think we've come to the end of our webinar today, just after 11:30. I've got one final question here which relates to, I suppose, the closing remarks in any event around access to these slides and to, I suppose, re-watching this video after this webinar is concluded. We will make copies of these slides available following the webinar. We'll get some information out about where they can be accessed through after the webinar. And you can also view a copy of this presentation on the same link that you accessed to join the webinar this morning. We'll also make copies of this presentation available from the sites of our partner agencies, from the CCC, the Integrity Commissioner and the Office of the Independent Assessor. So lots of places you can access a copy of this video after we're finished today. So I'd like to say in conclusion, thank you for joining us today. If you've got any final questions you'd like to send through, you can still do that via the link on the screen below you, and we will undertake to get back to you via email as soon as we can. We'll respond to you as soon as we can, and thanks for watching us all today. Thank you very much to our presenters who have taken the time to be here this morning. Thank you.